The wind clawed at the thin walls of the cabin, a hungry, keening sound that mirrored the emptiness in her gut. Alara huddled deeper into the threadbare blanket, the cold seeping through the rough-hewn floorboards, stealing the last vestiges of warmth. Outside, the world was a brutal expanse of white and gray, the mountain passes already choked with snow, sealing her in this desolate trap. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since Pa hadn't come back from town. 3 weeks since the supplies dwindled to dust and desperation became a constant companion. She was alone, terrifyingly alone, in a place that tolerated few, and actively despised those like her caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. Her mother's blood pulsed warm beneath skin the color of river stone, a constant visible mark of difference in the stark white settlements. Pa had shielded her, but Pa was gone. Now the world pressed in, cold and indifferent, or worse, actively hostile. Hunger was a dull ache, but the fear was sharp, a jagged stone in her chest. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, was a potential threat. She imagined the faces in town, the cold eyes, the muttered slurs. No one would come looking. No one cared if the half-breed girl and her eccentric father vanished into the winter snows. Survival instinct, thin and fragile, was all she had left. She rationed the dried beans, chewed on strips of stiff, tasteless jerky, melted snow for water. The silence was deafening, broken only by the storm's fury and the frantic beat of her own heart. Then a different sound, a heavy, rhythmic crunching outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Human footsteps. Her breath hitched, freezing in her throat. She scrambled, silent as a mouse, to the small, grimy window, peering out from behind a scrap of sacking. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, was silhouetted against the swirling snow. He wore a duster coated in frost, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A rifle was slung across his back. He moved with a weary but deliberate purpose, heading straight for the cabin. Outlaw, the word flashed in her mind, sharp and certain. Nobody respectable traveled this deep into the winter peaks alone, armed, and looking like they were running from something. Panic flared, hot and suffocating. Where could she hide? The small cabin offered no real concealment. Under the floorboards? Up the chimney? He reached the door, a dark, imposing shape. A gloved hand reached out, pushing tentatively. The door, old and warped, groaned open inwards. He stepped inside, shaking off snow, the cold air following him. Alara pressed herself flat against the wall behind the rough-hewn table, praying the shadows and her stillness would make her invisible. He paused just inside, his head turning slowly, scanning the single room. His eyes, shaded by the hat brim, seemed to pierce the gloom. She held her breath, every muscle tensed, ready to bolt, though bolt where? Into the storm? He didn't speak. He just stood there for a long moment, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. The scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and something wild filled the small space. He took another slow breath, then seemed to dismiss the inspection. He moved towards the cold hearth, dropping his saddlebags with a thud. He was not loud, not boisterous, but his presence filled the cabin, pushing back the silence, replacing it with a new, potent tension. Fear warred with a flicker of something else, stark curiosity, born of profound loneliness. But fear remained dominant. He was a man, alone, armed, and on the run. Men like that brought trouble, and she was already drowning in it. He knelt by the hearth, collecting kindling with movements that were practiced and efficient. He struck a match, and a small, hesitant flame licked at the wood, pushing back the cold, casting dancing shadows that made the room seem both smaller and more menacing. Alara remained frozen, a small, terrified statue in the corner, waiting for him to notice her, waiting for whatever would come next. He didn't acknowledge her presence, not with a look, not with a word. It was as if she were part of the furniture, or perhaps a mouse he'd spotted but deemed too insignificant to bother with. He built the fire with economic movements, adding larger pieces of wood until it crackled cheerily, the warmth a welcome contrast to the biting air still seeping in. He took off his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, eyes the color of a winter sky, direct and watchful. His hair was dark, a little too long, brushing the collar of his worn shirt. He had a tired look, lines etched around his eyes and mouth, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet strength that was almost unsettling. He didn't fidget, didn't talk to himself, just methodically went about making himself comfortable. He took a tin cup from his saddlebag, filled it with snow from a small bucket by the door, and set it near the fire to melt. Then he unwrapped a piece of hardtack and began to chew it slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. Alara remained hidden, her initial panic slowly giving way to a wary observation. He wasn't loud, wasn't menacing in an obvious way. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't even looked directly at her since that first scan. She watched him through narrowed eyes, trying to decipher his intentions. Was he waiting for her to reveal herself? Was this some kind of game? Or was he simply so focused on his own immediate needs, warmth, rest, food, that she truly hadn't registered as a threat or a problem? Hours passed in this silent standoff. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside, the fire grew strong, filling the cabin with its glow and warmth. The small space felt strangely compressed, occupied by his quiet power and her trembling fear. At one point he stood, stretching his arms above his head, a ripple of muscle beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. He moved with a grace that surprised her, for a man who looked so rugged and weary. He glanced towards the door, then towards the small window, a silent check of his surroundings. His gaze swept over her hiding spot, but again, he showed no sign of seeing her. He returned to the fire, took a sip of the now-melted water, and then, to her astonishment, he pulled out a small, worn harmonica. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands, before bringing it to his lips. The sound that emerged was low, mournful, a melody that spoke of distance and loneliness, but also of a strange, resilient hope. It was a startling contrast to his tough exterior. The music filled the cabin, pushing back the fear, momentarily transfixing her. It spoke a language she understood, a language of longing and survival. When he finished, the silence returned, heavier now with the echo of the tune. He carefully put the harmonica away. He took out a knife and a piece of wood, and began to whittle, the shavings falling silently to the floor. The rhythm of his carving, the soft scraping of the blade, was another quiet sound in the room. He didn't look up. He didn't try to engage her. He simply existed in the space, allowing her to exist too, in her fear and her hiding. Slowly, tentatively, the edge of her terror began to dull. He wasn't ignoring her out of malice, it seemed, but out of acceptance? A strange, unspoken understanding? It was dangerous to think that way. He was still an outlaw, still armed, still a man who had likely done terrible things. But he wasn't behaving like the men she had learned to fear in town. He wasn't loud, demanding, or cruel. He was just there, quietly there, in the firelight, whittling wood and making mournful music. Days bled into a week. Silas, she heard him mutter the name to himself once, remained in the cabin. He didn't ask who she was, or where Pa was, or why she was alone. He simply lived alongside her, in a silent, uneasy truce. He would go out hunting, returning with a rabbit or a grouse, cleaning it expertly outside in the snow. He cooked over the fire, and the smell of roasting meat, real meat, was almost intoxicating after weeks of near starvation. He didn't offer her any initially. She still hid behind the table or in the shadows near the loft ladder, watching him with intense, wary eyes. But he would leave portions of the cooked meat by the edge of the hearth when he went out again, or when he settled down for the night. Small, silent offerings. At first, she was too afraid to touch them, suspecting a trap. But hunger was a relentless master. One night, when his breathing deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep, she crept out. The meat was warm, fragrant. She snatched it, retreating back into her corner to devour it like a starved animal. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. This became a pattern. Silent hunting, silent cooking, silent offering, silent taking. No words passed between them. He would leave food, and later, sometimes, she would leave small things she found in the cabin. Dried herbs Pa had collected. A clean rag, would already cut small enough for the fire. A silent exchange, building a bridge across the chasm of fear and mistrust. She began to emerge from her hiding places more often during the day, though she kept her distance, always ready to dart away. She watched him as he mended his gear, cleaned his rifle, sat by the fire lost in thought. He was careful with his movements, always aware of his surroundings, his gaze sweeping over the cabin and its silent, watchful occupant. There was no softness in him, not outwardly, but there was a lack of cruelty that was its own form of kindness. He didn't demand, didn't judge, didn't hurt. In the eyes of the world, he was an outlaw, a danger. But to her, he was the man who shared his fire, who left food for the scared, silent girl he found alone in the wilderness. The deep snow persisted, isolating them further. Supplies in his saddlebag dwindled. The hunting became harder. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would happen when the food ran out completely? One afternoon, a new sound broke the routine silence. Voices. Loud, rough voices, echoing up the mountain path. Not Silas's voice. Not familiar. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas was instantly alert, his head snapping up. He didn't grab his rifle, not yet. He just listened, his body tense. "Cabin's up here, ain't it?" A voice boomed, closer now. "Heard old man Davies had a good stock. Maybe that lowlife is holed up there, lowlife." They were talking about Silas. Alara realized with a jolt of fear that she was now caught between her own precarious existence and the danger that followed him. Silas moved swiftly, silently. He extinguished the fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness save for the weak light through the window. He grabbed his rifle. He looked at Alara, a brief, intense look, the first direct, acknowledging gaze she had received from him. There was no fear in his eyes, only grim determination. He didn't tell her what to do. He didn't need to. She understood instinctively. This was his trouble, but it was now hers too. She melted back into the deepest shadows, near the small, dark space under the loft stairs. The cabin door burst open with a kick, letting in a blast of cold air and two rough-looking men, silhouetted against the snowy landscape. "All right, Silas. We know your dash." The words died in their throats. Silas stood by the hearth, rifle raised, a silent, deadly figure in the gloom. "Get out." His voice was low, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying immense weight. One of the men, the bigger one, laughed. A harsh, unpleasant sound. "Figured you'd be here. Heard you cleaned out the bank in Haven. We'll take that coin and maybe split the old man's stores." He took a step forward. "Last chance," Silas said. The air crackled with tension. The second man, younger and jumpier, shifted his weight. "Look, Silas, we don't want trouble. Just dash." He didn't finish. Silas fired. The shot was deafening in the small space. The older man cried out, clutching his arm, staggering back. The younger man yelped, fumbling for his own weapon. Silas moved with lightning speed, crossing the room in 2 strides, bringing the butt of his rifle down hard on the younger man's head. He crumpled without a sound. The wounded man, his face pale with pain and fear, scrambled backwards towards the door. "You crazy son of a bitch," he spat. "They'll hunt you down." Silas didn't reply. He just advanced, relentless. The man, seeing the look in Silas's eyes, turned and fled out into the snow, clutching his injured arm. Silas watched him go for a moment, then closed the door firmly. The cabin fell silent again, save for the heavy breathing of Silas and the unconscious man on the floor. Alara remained in her hiding place, trembling, her small body pressed against the cold wood. She had seen violence before, but never so sudden, so brutal, so close. Silas didn't look at her. He knelt beside the unconscious man, quickly disarming him, checking him over with practiced hands. "He'll live," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He dragged the man over to a corner, tying his hands securely with a length of rope from his saddlebag. Then he stoked the fire back to life, the flames illuminating his face, which was once again impassive, controlled. But Alara saw something in his eyes, a weariness, a deep sadness that went beyond the surface. He sat back on his heels, the rifle resting across his lap. "They'll be back," he said, his voice quiet, finally acknowledging her presence. "Or they'll send others." He looked at her directly this time, his gaze steady. "You can't stay here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She was no longer just the silent girl in the corner. She was a witness, and her safety was now inextricably linked to his actions. But where could she go? The storm was still raging outside, and even if it cleared, the world beyond this cabin held its own dangers for her. She didn't up slowly, her legs stiff, her small figure emerging from the shadows. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes wide, reflecting the firelight. For the first time, their gazes met and held, not in fear, but in a shared understanding of their predicament. He had protected himself, and in doing so, had protected her from the men who would have surely harmed her too, once they were finished with him. He hadn't saved her out of heroism, perhaps, but out of necessity, or maybe, just maybe, that quiet, unspoken kindness. He was an outlaw, a man outside the law, but in the harsh, lawless wilderness, his actions had been more merciful than the judgment she faced from respectable society. Resilience, she realized, wasn't just about enduring the cold and the hunger. It was about finding a way to stand, even when the world tried to break you, and finding unexpected alliances in the most unlikely of places. He looked at her, a long, assessing gaze. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of the path ahead. But the fear was no longer paralyzing. It was tempered now with a nascent strength, a quiet resolve born of having faced the wolf at the door and survived, not alone, but with the silent, unexpected help of another outcast.